As an aside, isn't it great to live in a democracy where the who you get to vote for is decided based on who can sort of best navigate the legal machinery and arcana of challenging people's eligibility and so on. I really like that part of our system. It really, really makes my constitutional heart throb with pride.
Yeah.
It's called meritocracy, baby. Yeah.
It's pretty disgusting, but at the same time, not to return to dialectics as I often do, but it is a dialectic. So much of the law is dialectics. And, this mechanism that's been used to keep people out, all it is a legal mechanism. And if you have enough people organized, you can defeat it. And we have before, and we're going to do it again.
Preach, sister. I love it.
A quick note before we get started here. This is our second attempt to interview Emma Caterine. So, as you'll hear us reference that fact. The first one was lost due to technical glitches. Very unfortunate, but happens in the business sometimes. So, let's get started.
Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. And today we have Emma Caterine. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Okay.
First try.
Well, I will certainly...
Don't worry, there's at least one more name that you could possibly screw up that we're going to talk about. So.
What did I mess up? I couldn't remember the word crucifixion the last episode.
Well,
oh, God.
I think you made up a good word. It was crucifixion? Was the word you used?
Yeah.
Which I think that should become part of the normal parlance, if you will. I like that.
I'm a lapsed Catholic, so maybe it's just that part of me, but that just sounds like some sort of sacrament.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. Now it's time for the crucifixion. Yeah.
The crucifixion will commence. Only if you've fasted properly. Very good. Yeah. So welcome back.
Thanks. I'm happy to be back on.
Yeah. So Emma is I think an aspiring lawyer. Is that correct to say?
Actually, no, I am a lawyer. I became a lawyer since our last attempt. So.
Oh, nice.
I think that is causally connected. I'm going to take credit for that.
The Faustian bargain has been made, and I'm lost forever.
Yeah.
Well, it's worth it.
So, legal scholar, someone who's involved with DSA and with I was listening to the Chris Hayes podcast with the woman, I forget her name, but the prison culture on Twitter, that lady, and she was saying that what we have in the United States is not a criminal justice system. We have a criminal punishment system, and I think that's a very apt way of putting it.
Yes.
And so, you've written a lot of great stuff about like reforming the criminal punishment system that we have, and maybe trying to transform it into a criminal justice system. And so, yeah, we'll be talking a lot about trying to roll back mass incarceration, the sort of feminist aspects of the legal system as it exists, particularly with bankruptcy, and just like how we should think about trying to change this. It can be easy to forget about, but like we basically have a gulag system in the United States.
Yes, unfortunately.
I mean, it takes up something like 1% to 2% of the population, which is more or less about the same amount that was at the height of the Soviet gulags. Just an absolutely incomprehensible number of people who are sucked up into this system, and especially you're talking about like poor communities of color. It's like 2/3 of people have been in prison at some point or another. So Anyway, I think maybe a good place to start is with this article that you wrote for the Berkeley Journal of Gender Law and Justice. It's called "The Fresh Start for a Women's Economy Beyond Punitive Consumer Bankruptcy." So Joe Biden is in the news a lot for him being incredibly handsy with women, but maybe a way into his other incredibly anti-woman record is talking about bankruptcy reform. And so, this is in 2005, they passed this big bankruptcy reform, quote unquote, which changed a lot of things about how the bankruptcy process worked. And so I guess, first off, Emma, can you tell us about how what changed in that reform, just as a sort of matter of mechanics, when people would go before the court and try to sort out their bankruptcy process?
And not to rudely follow up his question with an addition supplement to that, but if you could back up and say maybe what the function of bankruptcy generally is, and then that might modify how the reform plays into it, possibly?
Yeah, good.
Sure. I think basically for some of the listeners who maybe are confused right now, being like, wait, are we going to talk about prison abolition or are we going to talk about bankruptcy? What are we doing here? I'm really interested in the way that our legal system punishes people both through the civil legal system as well as through the criminal legal system. And as a lawyer, I'm a private practitioner and I do FDCPA lawsuits, so I sue debt collectors. So I see every day the way that civil courts, through contract law, through consumer credit laws, punish people for what the laws have deemed to be bad behavior. Now, bankruptcy, of course, is a pretty stigmatized thing. I think probably most of your listeners and even most people with radical politics can't help but, immediately associate the word bankruptcy with things like failure, with giving up, with financial ruin. What bankruptcy actually is it's a way for our economy to recycle stagnant capital. And in the consumer context, it's especially important because our economy is really dependent on consumer expenditures. One of the things that I cite in the article is the percentage of our GDP that's made up of personal consumption, which was 68.7% as of towards the end of 2016. People's debt is what props up this spending, increasingly so, and you'll see that as our debt has increased, as the balance of household debt has increased, so has the amount of GDP that's made up of personal consumption. It's not a coincidence. It used to be that capitalists realized the importance of bankruptcy for this reason. And in fact, what we think of as bankruptcy, the modern bankruptcy system, came about following what I refer to as the Long Depression, the first economic depression the United States experienced in the 19th century. And it was in reaction to that it was actually the creditors who were like, we need bankruptcy for consumers because no one's going to take out loans if they are drowning in debt. No one is going to buy our stuff if people are drowning in debt. And so what this led to was access for consumers to get a form of debt relief. Debt relief itself is actually a very old practice. You can see it in the Bible. You can see it in nearly all of the ancient civilizations, usually in the form of what are called debt jubilees, where every certain amount of years, sometimes 7 years, sometimes 20 years, everyone's debts were forgiven. What this transformed into was a bankruptcy system, where in U.S. law, the purpose of bankruptcy was, to quote the Supreme Court, to give consumers a fresh start. And as our laws progressed, the neoliberal perspective on the role of the state as being primarily to punish, primarily to get people into line, and then also to support the market. People started looking at the bankruptcy system, both Republicans and Democrats like Joe Biden and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, looked at the bankruptcy system and they said to themselves, well, we don't think people should get this fresh start without some strings attached. We don't believe this is fair. And to be clear, at the time, this wasn't just a free ride for people. Bankruptcy has never been a great deal for people in the United States. It hurts your credit, hurts your ability to get credit in the future. It takes a long time for it to be cleared from your credit report. And, of course, it comes with a lot of social stigma as well. And but what people like Joe Biden were upset about was this idea of a profligate consumer, of people who were just going out and they were shopping and just clicking that plastic, just accumulating debt to buy cute clothes for themselves, and not caring that they didn't have the money to pay for it. And then when the debt got too overwhelming, they just went to bankruptcy and got rid of it. That wasn't really based in any sort of fact, as people like Elizabeth Warren desperately tried to tell Congress, unfortunately to little avail. A lot of these ideas of these profligate consumers were very gendered ideas. I was very happy to see in the Financial Times, like many pretentious leftists, I read the Financial Times every day. I was reading a story about Pinterest. They did a IPO recently, and I write about Pinterest in my article because it's this great example of this gendered consumer identity. And in this Financial Times article, they're talking about how Pinterest, their IPO was a little bit under, the share value is a little bit under their estimates. And they're saying, so they've been, trying to reassure investors that, hey, look, 80% of mothers are using Pinterest. And I was like, oh, this is fabulous. This is exactly what I was talking about in my article, is that our ideas of consumption are interlocked with gender identities. So, when Pinterest is trying to sell itself as, and it says this in the article as well, it's trying to sell itself as an alternative to the Google style of marketing. It's marketing by saying, oh yes, we can reach this many mothers. And, mothers is kind of the holy grail of the marketing world, because it is true that women do the majority of consumer expenditures for households in the United States. It's decreased substantially since, like the 1950s, 1960s, but it's still the majority. And it's, of course, no coincidence that when this 2005 bankruptcy law was getting passed, that it was talked about, by comparing, these people who are going out and recklessly spending, this is costing the average taxpayer, I forget the amount off the top of my head, I think it was like $300, and it's like, that's the same as 1 month of groceries for a family of 4. And so, and that example is great because the inference is, this woman is out shopping when she should be buying groceries for her family like a responsible person would do.
Yes. No, that's I'm glad you touched on that, and your article does a wonderful job. Everyone should read it, by the way, if you have any interest at all in the law or bankruptcy, especially. It's the most fun law review article. I've read a few, and as footnotes about Marx, it brings up, like pop culture. It's got, Herland, which we'll get to. It's just wonderful. But, the intersectionality that you address in your analysis is really important to me, because you show that the law, which is supposed to just be, right, fresh start for consumers, which actually, as you already pointed to, is in service of capital and unclogging kind of the circulation, right, of the flow of capital for the economy. Also, at the same time, and Ryan and I had an episode recently on Foucault, right, disciplines and punishes and establishes norms that can be gendered in different ways that intersect with class. So as you say, right, so women, they're just out shopping all the time, and there's this gendered notion of, which is reflected in, like, okay, so women have disproportionate amounts of consumption and also bankruptcy. But then, the class issue comes in, right, where some women, it's good that they shop a lot, and then other women, it's bad and they're irresponsible, right? So maybe you could talk a bit about how kind of the discipline and education of who's allowed to do what and who gets shamed or punished for what comes into play with the bankruptcy laws.
Yeah, so basically my argument is that our bankruptcy laws and our ideas of consumerism more generally are informed by this double bind of both the profligate spender and then also the uptight spendthrift or the uptight Scrooge, whatever reference you might want to use. And I go through a number of different cultural examples. I mentioned Pinterest before. I also talk about Pretty Woman. I talk about the novel McTeague, and then a television show called Queen for a Day. And basically my point is that we place women into a situation where they're being told, especially in the modern world, are being told 24/7 to buy things, that they will only be pretty if they buy things, that they will only be loved if they buy things, that they will, only give a good life to their children if they buy things, and so on and so forth. That's literally the theme of the show Queen for a Day is just literally the show just has mothers go on stage and they say what their problem is, and then the announcer is like, oh, well, here's some consumer good, like a washing machine or a vacuum or whatever, and this solves your problem. What the 2005 bankruptcy law did was it changed bankruptcy from a tool of relief to a tool of punishment. And it did that in a number of ways that I discuss in specific with the article, but the overarching one and really the sort of the thematic core of the 2005 bankruptcy law was creating what's called a presumption of abuse for people filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. So not to get too into the weeds, but it is, I think, good to understand the difference, especially for this article and just for your listeners' general understanding.
And Chapter 7 is the consumer bankruptcy, right?
So Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 are the two main forms of consumer bankruptcy. Chapter 11 is mostly used by corporations and sometimes by very rich people. Chapter 11 is basically the way that corporations really leverage bankruptcy. It's a very good form of bankruptcy, and of course that's why poor people don't get to use it.
It's the Trump bankruptcy.
Right,
it's the Trump bankruptcy.
The Trump bankruptcy. Though I believe at least one of his was a Chapter 7, but irregardless. So Chapter 7 bankruptcy is where is basically what you would generally think of as bankruptcy, where all of a person's assets, if they have any, are liquidated. They get a few exceptions. They get to keep at least one car so that, they can drive to work or whatever. And they're usually not kicked out of their home as long as their home isn't too fancy. And with most, poor people, they don't have any assets. So Chapter 7 is the best for them because they don't have to liquidate anything. And then at the end of the day, all whatever money they can put forward goes to their creditors. And even if it doesn't cover all of their debts, that's fine. The rest of the debts get discharged and they really get a fresh start. Chapter 13, on the other hand, is a glorified payment plan. Now, Chapter 13 is not without benefit. You still get what's called a bankruptcy stay, which for some people is the difference between whether or not they're going to lose their home. But under Chapter 13, people are generally going to have to pay 100% of the debts that they owed going into it. So it's not really debt relief as much as debt restructuring. And what the 2005 bankruptcy law did is it said, we are creating a presumption that people who are filing for Chapter 7 are abusing the system. And that's an important, not only for legal reasons, which I go into in the article, but also in terms of the sort of the discourse that arises from the law. When folks like judges and lawyers read the law, I think a lot of them like to think that they're just, these cold, neutral chess players just moving pieces across the board. But in actuality, of course, they're humans, as much as it may not seem like sometimes.
No, Emma, my understanding is they're chess players and they're umpires.
Yes.
Balls and strikes and chess pieces is mostly what's involved. That's my understanding. Well, let me ask you. It is so. My, poor familiarity with the 2005 quote unquote reform of bankruptcy. Was that when the means testing came in for consumer bankruptcy that kind of pushed people into Chapter 13 that might have wanted to do Chapter 7 in addition to this presumption of abuse, or is that something? So
okay. It is actually the presumption of abuse.
That's the same thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So abuse is presumed, and then you have to pass through this means test in order to get Chapter 7 relief. which is based on this measure called current monthly income, which takes the average of your last 6 months of income and then compares it to the median of the state income. It's not great. But even beyond, the sort of the people who are kept out of Chapter 7 through that way, it's also just an attitude adjustment, right? It's that judges, when they're evaluating bankruptcy, it is a full-on opening of the books on a person's life. Judicial determinations in bankruptcy are very much based on what they consider to be a person's appropriate lifestyle. I think you see some of the most blatant judgments of class and where a person's proper place is in terms of class in the bankruptcy system. One of the examples that I brought up, which is a great example of this intersection between gender and class, is a woman who applied for bankruptcy and was found to be in abuse of bankruptcy because she was spending too much, and the judge, for whatever reason, decided that it was important to note that she had gained over 23 pounds. I think the idea was that was somehow related to the clothes shopping. Compare that with another woman who was what the judge said was she was a high wage earner and that she had a penchant for shopping at luxury retailers. And he didn't say this to criticize her. He said
no.
that it was commensurate with her lifestyle and that it was
That's right.
to the creditor's benefit that she could continue to maintain her current position in society because that would also maintain her rate of pay. And you often see these arguments coming up in bankruptcy, and it's why the bankruptcy system just is so disproportionately applied across lines of class, and as I bring up in the article, not just class, but gender, and ProPublica did a great investigation about racial disparities in bankruptcy filings, showing that both judges and lawyers push Black debtors disproportionately into Chapter 13, even when you control for income and other factors.
Yeah, the law is not a neutral arbiter, and I think, Ryan, does this remind you of the Foucault at all in terms of the shift to kind of judging the soul of the individual instead of inflicting pain on the body, and having all these arbiters of who should be shamed and who should be told that they've gained too much weight because their lifestyle is inappropriate or not? I mean, this is just this is how the law disciplines and punishes, right?
Yeah. I mean, you see, I think, yeah, on the one hand, like this sort of class and gender and racial prejudice being expressed, through the process of bankruptcy. But I would also say, maybe it's worth sort of drawing out this point that I don't think that the 2005 reform was a sort of like pro-profit thing in a broad sense. Like it was, so Joe Biden is in the pocket of like, big student loan, big credit card, and so on. But
by the way, student loans not dischargeable, right, Emma?
That was one of the things in the 2005 bankruptcy law. Public student loans had actually already been non-dischargeable, with I think an exception where if the loan was older than like 5 years old, it could be discharged. But the 2005 bankruptcy law made all student loans, public and private, and no matter how old they were, it made them all exempt from discharge, which is just totally bizarre and without precedent in terms of consumer debt. There's really nothing else like it. And there's actually a good article that just came out recently on efforts to create discharge for student loan debtors under the current law. But ultimately, of course, we'll need to toss or seriously amend the 2005 bankruptcy law to provide true debt relief.
Yeah.
I think... Go ahead, Ryan. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess just to complete the circle here is like, as you were saying, back in the day, the capitalists realized that, it's necessary to create this sort of process by which people that have gotten in over their head with debt could just wipe the slate clean. They'll take a punishment. They won't be able to get more loans easily in the future, but they could get rid of it and they could start spending again. And they could start spending on behalf of, all of the retail manufacturers, the clothing and consumer goods and all that sort of thing, to keep the economy sort of pressurized, I guess. And what you see with this so-called reform is that it's like putting a sort of arterial plaque in the economy. It's clogging things up. And I think maybe the best example of this is after the housing the 2008 crisis. Obama had promised that he would support cram down legislation, which means which is to say the allowing someone to write down the value of their primary mortgage on their home to the actual value of the home according to the market in a bankruptcy proceeding, right? So if you're declaring bankruptcy and in the Chapter 7 process, if I'm not mistaken, you're usually allowed to keep your home. And then you could write down the value of the mortgage to the actual value. That's the cram down proceeding. You can do that with virtually any other kind of asset that you might owe on, a jet ski or something. Right. And he's stopped that process because Tim Geithner thought that it would harm the banks. It would harm the banks because they would have to realize gigantic losses on all these loans that they had on their books, which would be reduced in value. But the overall result was that the economy was it was basically just like tons of austerity, more or less. That all these consumers who would have otherwise been able to they would be in a sort of neutral position on their mortgage, were forced to pay on these shitty overpriced mortgages, and having an underwater mortgage ruins your credit too, and they were unable to spend. They couldn't. They had this debt overhang, and so they were instead of spending, they were trying to pay down this debt, and it slowed things down horribly. And that's one of the big reasons why the recovery after the crisis was so terrible, because people couldn't get out from under this vast overhang of mortgage debt. And I think it's like the sort of like logic of capitalist ideology is kind of undermining itself, in a very, very classic Hegelian dialectic situation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And with consumer bankruptcy, the purpose of it is a little bit different than you would get in like a corporate bankruptcy, for example, where it's usually quite literally to recycle capital, and including like fixed capital. A company may liquidate and, its factory gets sold off. When like Toys R Us, for example, with their bankruptcy recently, it got partitioned off. I believe that Kroger's got its like color scheme, and like, someone else got the mascot. Like the company is divided up and sold off to various different highest bidders. But with consumer bankruptcy, it's much more about people as the conduits for capital, and that they're not. It's not so much that the capital that they have is stuck, as much as that they are not able to move capital. That their bankruptcy ties their hands behind their back and doesn't allow them to make the consumer expenditures that really power the economy.
Yeah. Right. No, that's a great point. We need to talk about Herland and some of your responses from what I think is, a great radical Marxist perspective. But also, the reason we're talking about bankruptcy and then, what we will be talking about in terms of prison abolition and what kinds of DAs we should be supporting, both have to do with kind of the type of quote unquote reforms that are harmful, that kind of replicate the ways in which the status quo and capital oppress and subjugate people, but also the ways that maybe certain types of reforms, both within bankruptcy or within the prison system, can be radically opposed to that structure and try to liberate people from that oppression. So this is really interesting to me, like trying to reclaim law, right, whether it's civil or criminal, and work from within. Even though Audre Lorde says you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, it seems like maybe you are trying in theory and praxis to kind of take on both civil and criminal oppression from within. So that's kind of the big picture I'm thinking of right now. What about Herland? What about bankruptcy could change, and how would that look in order to not just serve capital's needs and subjugate and shape people according to these kind of classist and sexist norms? What could actually be liberatory?
Yeah, so this is often the case with U.S. law, and I'll definitely get into this more with the subject of district attorneys and the laws that are available to them. But again, there is this core purpose of bankruptcy in U.S. law to give consumers a fresh start in their financial lives. And that purpose is great, obviously. And I think what's really refreshing about that is it isn't just this sort of motivation that the capitalist had for creating consumer bankruptcy of, we have to, we got to declog the system every once in a while so we can keep making money. It's about the fact, it's about principles of forgiveness. It's about principles of people getting second chances, and of people being provided with very real material opportunities, not this sort of, Clarence Thomas take on the 14th Amendment sort of equality, but rather a sort of a true opportunity and equality. Of course, I don't think that bankruptcy in any form that we have seen it goes quite far enough. I think that there should be forms of debt relief that are not tied to any sort of punishment or stigma or really any other sort of detriment to the people who file for it. I think that working class people have generally suffered enough from consumer debt, and there's no reason to make them suffer further in the process of having that debt relieved. In terms of more immediate things, though, that we can do, this presumption of abuse stuff has got to go. The 2005 bankruptcy law in general needs to be revisited, and people like Joe Biden need to take accountability for the harm that they've done to working class people, to women, and to people of color in this country, or they need to be taken out of office and taken out of political life. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier is, and one of the things the 2005 bankruptcy law did was it mandated credit counseling and financial education, but used those as another form of punishment against people. And that's just not been proven to be effective. Obviously, the biggest cause of financial hardship is being poor, being working class, not making a lot of money, having, ridiculously high rents, especially proportionate to your income. We should not only teach people about how capitalism works and about how finance works, but we should be actively trying to reinvent those things, and we should create a culture of acceptance around public money investing in these things, both as an alternative to private credit, as well as to relieve people from private credit. Lastly, this is, I was writing this, God, when did I write this? I think in 2016, so this might be why I was so dismal. I do think that financial crisis is unavoidable. I think that even a lot of neoclassical economists and mainstream economists recognize, even if they call it a market correction or a market downturn rather than a crisis, that these things are built into the system. And particularly, I think that the next time a financial crisis happens, we need to look at bankruptcy and the lack of relief for consumer debt, and make sure that people see the role that played in the financial crisis. Because I think that was one of the great failings of the Great Recession, was that, there was, and I was part of Occupy Wall Street, and Occupy Wall Street was great at, adopting Joseph Stiglitz' 99% framing, 99% versus the 1%. It was great at, identifying Wall Street as a singularly, overwhelmingly oppressive force in our society. But it wasn't so great, although a lot of people tried to. There were debt jubilee projects that sort of arose from Occupy Wall Street that were really great. But it really failed to get into the public discourse that, all of these complex financial instruments like credit default swaps, these were ways of corporations making money off of the suffering of working class people. It wasn't just that, they were reckless and they were playing with fire and got burnt. No, these were things that were constructed to make money off of other people's, misery. And that's how our consumer debt system works. I listen, to debt collection calls a lot in my line of work. And, I hear people talk all the time about how, they're going to have to postpone their surgery in order to make payments. They're going to have to miss a meal to make payments. And, I'll ask debt collectors, I'll ask banks, I'll ask credit card companies, do you know that this is happening? And they say, well, yeah. And I mean, of course they know. And the issue is that we have stigmatized things. Both we have this sort of process of reification between our social and cultural norms in the law, where our, the sort of misogynist ideas of these profligate consumers inspired the 2005 bankruptcy law, which the presumption of abuse in that law in turn has inspired stigma around bankruptcy and people who are in debt. And it's a feedback cycle that reinforces itself over and over. And we have to break the cycle both in terms of the law and in terms of culture and society.
Yeah. This maybe is a good point to turn to the question of prison abolition that we were talking about before in the introduction. You wrote an article. We'll link it in the description about the candidate. I don't think this election has happened yet. For the DA candidate Tiffany Cabán.
Yes.
Did he say it right? Did he
get it? He did get it right.
Yes.
Wow.
He's on a roll today.
Amazing. It's amazing. Yeah, the election's in June, isn't
That's
it?
That's right.
Yeah. It's awesome.
Is the do we need to promote petition signing, or what's the deal at this point? Where are we?
Where we're at with the campaign is the petitions have been signed. One of the other DA candidates has filed an objection to the petitions. This is pretty common for any kind of insurgent or radical candidate. I helped with a very similar objection to Julia Salazar's campaign that they fought all the way up to the New York Court of Appeals, which is New York's highest state court. They got their butt kicked, and then they got their butt kicked in the election. So
nice.
I'm hoping.
Well done.
I'm hoping that we can repeat that with Tiffany Cabán's campaign, but it will really depend on folks in the New York City area going out and volunteering and making sure those doors get knocked.
And she's the candidate for Queens, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, the Queens District Attorney.
Yeah. As an aside, isn't it great to live in a democracy where the who you get to vote for is decided based on who can sort of best navigate the legal machinery and arcana of challenging people's eligibility and so on? I really like that part of our system. It really, really makes my constitutional heart throb with pride.
Yeah.
It's called meritocracy, baby. Yeah.
It's pretty disgusting, but at the same time, not to return to dialectics as I often do, but it is a dialectic. So much of the law is dialectics. And, this mechanism that's been used to keep people out, all it is a legal mechanism. And if you have enough people organized, you can defeat it. And we have before, and we're going to do it again.
Preach, sister. I love it.
And then it's
good.
It's kind of the flip. It's like America is sort of a pseudo democracy, but there are those elements in there, and it is the case where if you really try and you really have the people behind you. You can sometimes like get some purchase in there. And so, I think it's important not to just give up and say, the system is completely rigged. It's like mostly rigged, partly rigged, but it's not 100% fraudulent, and so you can get in there and change things. But yeah, I guess, to speak a little bit more about kind of, I guess, ideal theory issues, the prison abolition movement is sort of, I would say, it seems like it's sort of pointing to a future in which, like, police and courts and so on are just, they're just like sort of not a part of society. And so, maybe you could sort of illustrate that for us. I think it's kind of confusing for a lot of people. Like, it's hard to imagine, but like what would your sort of ideal future look like if you're thinking about a sort of Star Trek, future utopia? What's that going to look like?
Fun fact, I have never watched an entire episode of Star Trek.
Awesome.
I've been working my way through DS9 recently, and it's very good. I would definitely recommend it.
What is DS9? What does that mean? I don't even know
Deep
what that
Space
means.
Nine.
What does that mean?
This is a 1990s show with Captain Sisko, the best Star Trek captain.
Yeah.
Is that Patrick Stewart?
No.
No.
This is
He's hot. He's hot.
the only black Star Trek captain.
Ah.
I forget the name of the actor.
Now, Emma, should I
Brooks.
take you to mean that you attempted to watch Star Trek but could not finish an episode? Is that what you mean?
No, honestly, I've just never really tried. It's just not.
Okay.
I
You
don't
threw
know.
me off with the way you phrased that. Yeah.
It's just an interesting it's just funny to me that I've never seen an entire episode because all my friends love it. I'm a pretty nerdy person, so it seems like something I would have watched. But yeah.
Plus, lefty ideal, not having scarcity as a problem. That sounds great. That would be cool.
Yeah.
But you, nonetheless, push for some type of kind of utopian demanding, I would take it, within our scarce resource society that we live in, right? Like prison abolition, I really enjoyed what you wrote because from your work with actual people that are on the inside, it seems like you discovered that when people typically think of prison abolition as a movement, they think of what we're getting rid of or what we're dismantling. But there was this like recurring question. Well, what's the positive vision? What do you do instead, right?
Yeah.
So that really struck me. That touched you.
Yeah. I have done a little bit of work with people in prison over the years. It's work I'm very proud of, and. People, it really cannot be said enough that people in United States prisons are some of the most oppressed people in the world, some of the most dehumanized people in the world, and are also some of the bravest people I've ever met, some of the most resourceful and clever, and especially the jailhouse lawyers out there who more often than not are helping many others besides themselves. But I also, in the process of doing this work as a admittedly pretty naive white person, was pretty surprised by a lot of the reactions I got from people I was working with in prison to the idea of prison abolition. There's a lot of negative reactions, a lot of, either thinking that it was too idealistic or accepting, the sort of prison mentality of, these other people in here, they are criminals, they are monsters. It's just me. I'm just the one who's misunderstood and, it really made me, sort of think about, well, is this, am I, do I have the right vision here? Is this really the sort of vision that I should be promoting? And, and even more so, how does this sort of align with my politics around things like consumer debt and around socialism? This led me to sort of start thinking about prison abolition in a way that there's a really good book that I recommend called The Communist Horizon by Jodi Dean.
Yeah, that's good.
And one of the things that she talks about, the sort of the main theme of the book, is her conception of communism as this ideal, and not really as an ideal that is, maybe it is realizable, but it's not, we can all pretty safely say it won't be realized in our lifetime. But the point isn't to believe that we are going to realize it, but to move towards that horizon, even if it doesn't seem like it's getting any closer, that we should be moving towards it. And that's how I feel about prison abolition, because I think even a lot of the more reactionary people out there, more reactionary supporters of mass incarceration, will admit that prisons are terrible. They really are.
Yeah.
No one likes them. I don't think anyone, has ever been happy to walk through the doors of a prison, even if they're wearing a correction officer uniform. The ideal of having a world without prisons, and a world even more broadly without the sort of coercive punishment that prison is such a horrible example of, is the sort of world that people like me strive for. The sort of starting at the idea of how can we move towards a world without prisons, and towards a world where people are not punished in these sort of coercive and dehumanizing ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No, go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah. I think that, in terms of movements, I would absolutely agree with you. Where it's like you just as with many other policy areas, you look at international comparisons, and it's like we have this vast population of people in incarcerated or under parole supervision and so on, that is just totally unparalleled in the rest of the world. And America is a pretty violent country, but it's not that much more violent than Germany or something. And the prison that prison population is like 10 times better, and so they're 10 times larger. And so when you're talking about something like you mentioned, Larry Krasner's his policy of just getting rid of cash bail for a lot nonviolent offenses, and it's essentially like the result is there's no effect at all. That it was that like you were throwing all these people in jail for literally no reason. They still showed up to their hearings and so on, and it was completely pointless to be keeping them in these cages at vast public expense, by the way. Very expensive to be doing this.
Well, and not just at public expense in terms of how much the government spends, but also in terms of these bail bond companies that unfortunately the New York legislature failed to abolish like it should have when it recently passed the budget. But these bail bond companies are some of the scummiest people you could ever deal with. There's a woman here in New York who calls herself the queen of bonds companies, and she said that she only looks at people as walking money. These are just the sort of bottom feeders that are created when you have, and this is sort of the whole philosophy of prison abolition, realized that when you have systems of coercive punishment, it produces a sort of a rippling effect that creates more coercion, more violence, more fracturing of our society.
Yeah.
But that's what,
Go ahead.
Sorry, buddy. The system produces that woman and that queen who looks at people that way as much as it produces the people that are induced to go into debt to consume. Like that, the whole point is the system produces all of these things together to work together. And if we want to, we can realize that we don't need systems to just control us. We can control the systems, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you're trying to do, to work from within, whether it's Krasner or Tiffany Cabán. We can actually start to change the ways in which we induce or don't induce people to do these things. And we could, we'll have to do a separate episode on Herland. I just want to keep bringing it up. We can control the way that we live together. People get lost in the complexity sometimes, but we are determining for ourselves how we treat each other. And these systems and laws are simply reflections of how we choose to do that and what we're incentivizing, what we're punishing, what we're so it's it's not an accident that these people, it's not just these terrible people exist in the world. They're produced by this structure that we've created. And so we need to dismantle it, right?
Yeah, right. But to sort of finish my point there, there's a journalist for the LA Times who wrote this book called Ghetto Side, that was just looking at the just apocalyptic rate of murders amongst the poor black community in parts of Los Angeles. Very, very
right.
And there's something similar that happens like U.S. murder rate is very high, but it's the average is driven up by these just incredibly bad rates among certain impoverished communities of color. And her argument basically in that book is that there's a ton of murders in those communities because basically the police never solve them. They just don't. They don't. They've sort of allowed this situation to develop by where like gang violence is a sort of Hatfield and McCoy's type of situation where there is no adjudication of these violent disputes, and so people sort of develop gang culture as a sort of proto state, kind of warlordism type of thing, and so she doesn't. I mean, she says some good stuff about the ability of welfare and so on to sort of suck some of pull the diffuse a little bit of that violent competition out, but she's not saying that what we need is just psychopathically harsh punishments on every criminal, but saying that instead of just trying to do this affective demonstration where you make the penalties incredibly harsh, but then you're too incompetent or lazy to try to actually solve the crimes that happen, that what you need to do is you need to solve the crimes, and even if the punishment is not very harsh, or whatever, you need to make it clear in these communities, as I think it kind of is in a lot of white communities, that if someone is killed, if someone's murdered, then the state's going to come in here and it's going to find the perpetrator and it's going to levy some sort of punishment on them. And that is why the murder rate in European countries is much, much lower than it is in American these sort of inner city free for all type of places. And I don't know. So what would you say to this kind of notion of I mean, obviously we don't have that in this country, but the notion that this kind of has to be a necessary part of adjudicating violent personal disputes to have, a sort of punishment apparatus that takes people who commit grievous offenses and takes that away from the sort of instinctive desire for revenge, and gives a sort of neutral, at least as far as possible, kind of arbitration and punishment process.
Yeah, I think this is, there's a common misconception about prison abolition. And while there's a diverse range of what prison abolition means to different people, I think one thing that prison abolitionists generally agree on is that we are not seeking to absolve people of accountability or responsibility for wrongdoing, especially, of course, any kind of anti-social violence. I think the issue that's sort of revealed by that book, as well as sort of something that I focus on a lot, which is, the impunity of corporations from any kind of criminal prosecution, is that we have a two-tiered legal system, a two-tiered criminal punishment system, where crimes, the purpose of crime is to warehouse working class people and people of color, rather than to heal communities, rather than to prevent violence, and certainly to not hold corporations accountable or hold people accountable for, all of the sort of white-collar crimes that we see. And I think Tiffany Cabán's platform is sort of a great sort of example of this theory being put into practice, where, she's advocating for things like community advisory boards where people democratically engage with law enforcement to say, this is what we need and this is what we want. That, a recognition that community groups are often best at responding to gun violence rather than, I think the sort of the flip side of what you're talking about is, especially here in New York, you have neighborhoods where the cops won't show up or do anything for, months or even years. And then in one night they do giant gang raids where they arrest 200 random teenagers and charge them all with conspiracy. There's a famous case here called the Bronx 120, where literally 120 kids in the Bronx were arrested for things like posting, on Instagram with certain emojis that, apparently showed their gang affiliation. I posted that I was listening to Dead Prez on Instagram, so maybe I'm gonna get arrested for gang activity. But another thing that Cabán has pointed out is that our form of policing, and especially broken window policing and mass surveillance, modern policing, punishes entire communities for what is usually the antisocial violence committed by a very small amount of people. Generally, these sort of really violent offenses that are usually used to justify. Here we go. Her specific line is target the 6% who commit 60% of crimes.
Yep.
And her whole point is that declining to prosecute cases is not just about, refusing, for example, to enforce patently unjust laws like our prohibition of prostitution, which is just used to racially profile women of color, which is just used to arrest women for, carrying a condom. I mean, it's a ridiculous crime. It's not just about, not enforcing those unjust laws, but also not spending the district attorney's time and resources on what are fundamentally not dangers to our communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it seems to me there's this asymmetry, right? Which, with 2008, it was clear who brought down the global economy, but one person was prosecuted and people got golden parachutes. And so it's like we have clarity of who was causing evil, but because of, in much the same way that you talked about with kind of the high class earner who has a penchant for a nice lifestyle of shopping at, elite stores, and right in the same way, those are kind of the people that run the global economy. We can't go after them. But we know who's really guilty there. On the other hand, when there are crimes that cause lots of harm, but there's not an interest in who's actually committing them. There's just an interest in punishing communities generally. There's this kind of asymmetry, right? Where it's just such a backward system that, what Ryan suggests seems to be kind of one of many problems that have to be upended. And so it seems to me that going after corporations for their violations of tenants' rights, for their violations of all kinds of crimes would be great, while at the same time, like you say, not enforcing putatively just like unjust laws that are just trying to oppress and push people down. So it's really important that you're supporting this campaign, and I hope we can start to change things from the inside.
And from a theory perspective, what's really exciting is that we're seeing a lot of folks, both who come from a background of working on prison abolition and issues of the criminal punishment system, and then also people coming from the other perspective of socialist. Like the Democratic Socialist of America, for example, the organization that I'm in, passing a resolution in 2017 endorsing the concept of prison abolition. And then there's a great book, which I haven't finished yet. I'm making my way through, Carceral Capitalism by Jackie Wang, which is has so far been a really great realization of the interconnectedness between the financial system, between for-profit capitalism in general, and mass incarceration.
Yeah, that sounds like good stuff. Haven't read that book, but I'll have to check it out. We should probably let you go, though. Emma Caterine is on Twitter. We will link that in the description. Thanks for coming on so much.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
And please come back and we'll force Ryan to read her list.
Sounds good.
All right.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.